Good morning, class. We're going to do another little mini history lesson here today, and we've looked at the lives of women who have lived in modern times. Today what we're going to do is jump back to the 1600s and the 1700s and find out what life was like for a woman in the 13 colonies when our country was first getting started. Alright, you're probably wondering why do we have a picture of sheep on our screen when we're talking about women? Well, in the 1600s, the first manufacturing was starting to take place, and the first industry was the textile industry. Now, the textile industry is really interesting because that's how we make clothes. So what was happening in England is that many small farmers that just had enough land to feed their family, they grew wheat, they grew vegetables, they might have had some animals like sheep or goats. They were losing their land to richer people. These business people were snapping up land because they realized that if they raised sheep, the wool could be sheared off of sheep, and then that would be used to make textiles. So thousands of poor peasants, these small farmers, were losing their lands. And when they lost their lands, well, you got to find a job. You have to feed your family. They would go to the big cities, and sadly, when they got there, some were able to find jobs in these new textile industries or go to work in the coal mines in Great Britain, but most of them, no jobs. England is a little bit different because it's an island country, and so it was heavily populated. And usually it's bad for a government to have lots of people out of work worrying about how to feed their families, because they tend to start rebellions. So the English came up with this system of, let's see if I can do this, indentured servants. So let me whoa, yeah, it looks good here. I'll kind of circle that word, indentured servants, and I can put some special words along with that. We want to think of contracts or agreements or the word loan. Indentured servants have a connection to all of those words. Poor people didn't have the money to go to the colonies, so what would happen is that they would go to the colonies anyway, and once they got there, their passage was paid for by a richer individual. And then, as part of the agreement, these indentured servants would work for a period of 5 to 7 years for the master to pay off the debt of coming over. Another interesting thing is that at about the same time these indentured servants are coming over, Africans are being kidnapped from Africa, and they're coming to America, and they're slaves. So they're going to work on plantations in the South. Actually, they're going to work all throughout the 13 colonies. All the 13 colonies had slavery at the start of the 1600s and 1700s. Okay, so let's continue on. And I just wanted to cover a little bit of the rights for indentured servants. So remember, an indentured servant is a man, a woman, or a child that's arrived in the colonies. Their contract has been bought by a wealthier person, and usually what they have to do is they have to work for that person anywhere from 5 years to 7 years to pay off their passage to the New World. So if you're the master, you want to make as much money off this person as possible. So you work them very hard. You don't provide them with, you give them a basic diet that will keep them healthy and able to work, but it's not like they're eating steak or anything. And then the discipline is very harsh for the lazy. So if the master doesn't think you're working hard enough, you can get a pretty severe beating out of that. And then in this day and age, there's always the danger of disease. So if you got sick, it was more or less your body against the disease, and oftentimes the diseases won. Females had even fewer rights, so the master had to approve any marriages. So if a female indentured servant fell in love with somebody, they had to get permission to get married, and usually the master is not going to give permission for that marriage to take place. And the reason for this is that they don't want their female servants to get pregnant. If their female servant gets pregnant, that means that they work less for them, because there's going to be time toward the end of their pregnancy when they can't work, and then once the baby's born, they're going to need to nurse and take care of that infant too. So they would get less work out of them. So marriage was definitely a problem for single female indentured servants. So you can kind of see why this system isn't going to last very long. And coming to that, I just mentioned that the masters didn't want their female indentured servants getting pregnant. The other problem is running away. It was really easy for an indentured servant to run away. They could go to a bigger city and it would be easy for them to blend in because they would look like everyone else. And you have to remember, in the 1600s and 1700s, there was not photography. You don't have IDs. So once a servant had run away, it was really difficult to track them down. So this here is a picture of the ship the Mayflower, and the Mayflower is famous because it brought the Pilgrims to the to the colony of Massachusetts in 1620. There were 18 women that were on board that ship, and the families lived on the ship for quite a few months in order to, establish their village and start farming and things like that. So the women and the children were in confined spaces aboard this ship. And just to show you how hard life was, by the spring of the 18 women that came over on the Mayflower, only 4 of them are still alive. So that's kind of like an appalling death rate to see that many women die in the space of about 6 months. And part of this is that childbirth is really, really dangerous for a woman. In the 1600s, the 1700s, and even in the 1800s, you had your children at home. There was not a hospital. Sometimes you had a woman called a midwife who was experienced with delivering children, but basically if anything went wrong during the delivery of the baby, probably the mother is going to die and the child would also die. So when you go back into the historical records and look at things, husbands often married 2, 3, 4 times because they would lose wives typically during childbirth. And I should also add that women worked harder than their husbands, because women were expected to do everything that a man did. So if we are farmers, the women were out there plowing the soil, they're out there weeding the gardens, they're out there harvesting the crops, they're out there tending the animals, they're taking care of the sheep, they're milking cows, they're slaughtering pigs, everything that their husbands did, with the added addition that the woman is expected to take care of the children. So in colonial times, women worked much, much harder than their husbands did. All right, so let's conclude a little bit about another way that life was tough for women in the colonies. Marriage wasn't a very fair thing in the colonies. Women were definitely second-class citizens. So having an affair was nasty. If a woman was caught having an affair, she would be severely punished by her community. The men, on the other hand, not much punishment happened to them. It's like the old rule with boys will be boys. Unfortunately, that extends way back to this time. Divorce was also very difficult. In the southern colonies, it was pretty much impossible. In the northern colonies, divorce was possible, but there was an incredible stigma with it. So if a woman asked for a divorce from her husband, and the courts gave it to her. Usually what this meant is that this woman is going to be very, very poor. The courts aren't going to force her husband to pay alimony or money to help take care of her. And then there's this incredible stigma of shame that goes with divorce too, that there's something wrong with this woman here. She's evil, she's immoral, she has gotten divorced, she's left her family. Here you see a picture of a woman in a stockade. So what I'm assuming is this was kind of typical, that this was probably a woman who got caught having an affair. She was married and she was having relations with another man. She got caught. And so the judgment of the court or the community was to put her into this stockade. So it's not, you're not physically being beaten or harmed, but you're locked in there and you can't get out. And then members of the community typically would come by and yell insults at you, and they can even hurl things like tomatoes or worse things than that. So life was tough for women in the colonies. That's a little bit of a snapshot of what it was like. And some of our first settlers came to the 13 colonies as indentured servants. And an indentured servant was under contract to pay off their voyage to the new land. So watch this video as many times as it takes to get an idea of what life was like in the colonies and how life was much tougher for a woman than for a man.